My aunt took my wrists in her 2 hands the morning of my wedding and turned them over like she was checking a piece of fruit for bruising. She pressed her thumb into the meat of my palm and nodded once, satisfied, the way you nod at a good horse. Behind her, through the open door, I could hear my mother scrubbing the porch boards even though the wedding was in 4 hours and no guest would ever look down. The room smelled like cedar and lamp oil and the particular sourness of nerves. I stood still and let my aunt turn my hands over twice, and I did not ask why, because by then I already understood that a bride's body was not entirely her own in the week before her wedding. What I did not understand yet was that my hands were not the only thing that would be checked, and that the second inspection, the one that came later that night, would be the one I never spoke of for 31 years. My name is Rachel, and this is Rachel the Amish Midwife. I spent 26 years delivering babies across a settlement in Holmes County, which meant I was present for the beginning of nearly every family's story, and, more often than the community liked to admit, the end of some of them too. Women told me things in labor they told no one else, because pain strips away the performance of a good life. This channel exists because I carried those bedside truths in silence for decades, and I am done doing that. Before I go further, if you are here for the first time, I would ask you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because these stories only reach the people who need them if enough of you are willing to carry them forward. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Now let me tell you what a husband was permitted to inspect before a wedding, and why mine did it twice. In the world I grew up in, a marriage was not only a joining of 2 people, it was the transfer of a working asset from one household to another, and everyone understood this even though no one said it in those words. A young woman's worth was measured the way you would measure a plow horse before a purchase. Her hands, her back, her teeth, her temperament, her capacity for labor across 40 or 50 years of a shared life. A wife who cannot work is a wife who cannot love, the bishop said once at a members' meeting, and the women in the room nodded because it was true inside that world, even as it flattened something enormous down into something small. Before a wedding, it was understood, never written, never spoken aloud to outsiders, that a groom's family, sometimes the groom himself, could look at her hands for calluses that proved she sewed and canned and milked, at her teeth, because a woman with bad teeth was a woman who would cost money later, at the straightness of her spine, because a crooked spine meant a shorter working life. This was not called an inspection, it was called getting to know the family, and it happened in kitchens, over pie, with everyone smiling. The cost of that system was never named at the time. I understand it now as something closer to a shopping trip that both families agreed to pretend was a courtship. I was 19, the autumn Levi Yoder began coming to our farm on Sunday evenings. He was 23, broad through the shoulders, quiet in the particular way that men in our community mistook for depth. His family had a dairy operation 2 farms over, 60 head of cattle, which my father mentioned to my mother in a tone he thought I could not hear through the wall. The first time Levi came to supper, his mother came with him, and she sat across from me the entire meal, watching my hands as I served. She watched me lift the roasting pan, watched me carry it without a pot holder folded twice the way some girls did, watched me set it down without a sound. Afterward, in the kitchen, she took my hand in hers the way my aunt would later take my wrists, and she turned it palm up and ran her thumb across the base of my fingers. "Good calluses," she said. "You've been working." I said thank you, because I did not yet have another way to receive that sentence. 3 weeks after that, Levi asked to walk with me after the Sunday singing, and I said yes because saying yes to a walk was the only real choice a 19-year-old girl in that world was permitted to make about her own future, and even that choice existed inside a frame someone else had built. We walked the fence line at the edge of my father's property in the dark, and he did not touch me, did not try to, which at the time I understood as respect. What I understand now is that it was patience, the patience of a man who already believed the outcome was settled, and saw no reason to rush a thing that belonged to him already. He talked about the dairy operation. He talked about how many acres his father intended to give him when he married. He asked me, once, if I could can 40 quarts of tomatoes in a single day. And I said yes, and he nodded the way his mother had nodded over my hand. The engagement was announced in November, published from the pulpit the way all our engagements were, and from that Sunday forward I belonged to a season of preparation that the community treated as sacred, and that I now understand as something closer to inventory. My mother and I sewed. We canned early for the wedding meal. My hope chest, cedar, my grandfather's work, with a brass latch that had gone green at the edges, filled slowly with linens and quilts I had pieced myself, each one a small, silent proof of capability laid into the wood. I did not think of it as being examined. I thought of it as becoming ready. There is a particular cruelty in a system that teaches a girl to experience her own evaluation as her own accomplishment. My friend Verna Miller was engaged that same season to a man from a family with a reputation for hardness, and her hope chest filled slower than mine, because Verna's hands shook. She had shaken since she was a child, a tremor no doctor in that world was permitted to name, and her stitches came out uneven, no matter how many times she picked them apart and started again. I sat with her some evenings while she worked, and I watched his mother's face when she visited, watched it move across Verna's uneven hemwork, the way you would watch a buyer's face move across a horse's teeth. Verna married him in March. I will tell you the rest of what happened to Verna later, because it does not end where you think, and I am not finished with it. By the first week of December, 6 days before the wedding, my mother took me aside in the wash house and told me, in the flattest voice I had ever heard her use, that Levi's mother would be coming once more before the ceremony, this time to look over the hope chest itself. I asked why the chest needed looking over a second time, since she had already seen the linens laid across our kitchen table in October, and pronounced them fine. My mother did not answer the question directly. She only said, "It is her right, before the wedding," and went back to wringing the wash, and I understood from the set of her shoulders that this was not a conversation she wished to continue. Levi's mother came on a Saturday afternoon, unfolded every quilt in that chest one at a time, ran her fingers along the seams the way you would run a finger along a fence line checking for a break, and set each one back exactly as she had found it. She did not compliment the work this time. She only nodded, twice, the same economical nod her husband would give my hands 4 days later. And I remember thinking, even then, half-formed and unspoken, that I had never once seen anyone check over a groom's belongings the same way. I want to pause here for a moment before the story goes further, because if this is landing with you, if any part of what I've described is starting to feel familiar in your own bones, take one moment to like this video. Every like tells me this story is reaching the people who need it, and it means more than you know. The wedding was set for the second Thursday in December, and the week before, Levi's father came to our farm alone, without Levi, without his wife, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon when he knew my father would be in the far field and not in the yard to greet him. My mother let him into the front room and went to find me, and I remember drying my hands on my apron as I walked in, still smelling of the lye soap from the wash I'd been doing, not knowing yet that the smell of that soap would be the thing I remembered clearest 31 years later. He did not sit. He asked me to hold out my hands, and I did, because refusing was not a shape my mind had been built to hold yet. He turned them over the way his wife had, the way my aunt would on my wedding morning, but he held them longer, and he pressed harder at the base of my thumb, at the place where a hand shows the years of work already done to it. Then he asked me to open my mouth. I did not understand at first. He asked again, more plainly, and I understood he wanted to see my teeth, the way you would check a mare before a sale, and I opened my mouth in my mother's front room while my mother stood in the doorway and said nothing. I said nothing either. I stood there. I said nothing. He nodded, the way they all nodded, and he said, "She'll do fine." Not to me, to the room, to no one in particular, the way you'd say it about livestock that had passed inspection. Then he left, and my mother closed the door behind him, and neither of us spoke about it again for 3 decades. By the second week of that December, 4 days before my wedding, I understood that I had already been inspected twice by the family I was about to join, once by his mother's hand over supper, once by his father's hand and eyes in my own front room. And I remember standing at my open hope chest that same night, looking at the linens I had folded so carefully, and feeling for the first time that the chest and I were not entirely different objects. We had both been prepared. We had both been checked. We were both, in some way I did not have language for yet, about to be delivered. The wedding itself I remember only in pieces. The cold of the barn where the meal was served, the particular blue of Levi's shirt, my hands cold inside my mittens on the ride over. What I remember with more clarity is standing in the receiving line afterward, while Levi's mother took my hand one final time, in front of everyone, and turned it over once more, publicly this time, and said to the women standing near her, "See, I told you. Good hands." And the women laughed, warmly, the way you laugh at a joke that is not entirely a joke, and I laughed too, because that was what the moment required of me, and I filed the laugh away somewhere I would not find again for a very long time. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here, not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead. Slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Births They Never Recorded. 46 pages of what I actually witnessed at those bedsides. No softening, no cuts. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. The years that followed were not cruel in any way I could have pointed to and named at the time. Levi was not a violent man. He never raised his hand to me, never raised his voice much beyond the ordinary frustrations of a farm and 6 children and 38 cows. But I noticed things I did not have words for. He asked, most Sundays for the first several years, to see my hands before church, turning them over the way his father had, checking for softness, for the absence of new calluses, as though my worth needed to be reconfirmed on a schedule. When I began attending births as a midwife's apprentice in my late 20s, he asked to see my hands after too, checking, I understood only much later, not for injury, but for evidence, proof that the hands were still capable, still working, still the asset that had been approved in my mother's front room all those years before. I remember one particular Sunday in our 2nd year of marriage, standing at the wash basin before church with my hands still damp, when Levi came in from the barn, took both my hands in his without a word, and turned them over, checking the pads of my fingers for softness, the way his father once had in my mother's front room. I did not pull away. I stood at that basin. I said nothing. He set my hands back down gently, almost tenderly, and went to find his good shirt, and neither of us spoke of it again that morning, or any morning after. It was not cruelty, it was certainty. It was the absolute conviction, shared by nearly everyone I knew, that a woman's body existed partly for her own use, and partly as a kind of collateral the household could verify whenever it needed reassurance. I do not say this to make Levi into a monster, because he was not one, and I want to be honest about that even now. He worked from before light until after dark. He never once let our children go hungry. There were nights he sat up with a sick calf until dawn, out of a love for the animal that was not performance. And there were mornings he brought me coffee before I asked for it, quietly, without comment, in a way that I understood as its own kind of tenderness inside a marriage built on a framework neither of us had chosen. The system that raised us both was not without goodness in it. I would be lying to you if I said otherwise, and I did not leave that community to tell you lies. I told you I would come back to Verna, and I will keep that promise now. Her marriage did not fail in the way you might expect, the way a marriage might fail on television, with shouting or with scandal. It simply narrowed, year after year, the way a road narrows into a lane, and then into a path, and then into nothing you could call a road at all. Her husband never forgave her hands for shaking. Not truly. Not even after 14 years and 5 children who all grew up with steady hands of their own. I visited her twice a year, at the birth of each child, and each time I noticed something smaller about her than the visit before. Her voice a little quieter, her opinions a little more absent from the room, her eyes moving to her husband's face before she answered even simple questions, checking, the way she had once been checked, to see if the answer would pass inspection. I do not know, even now, whether Verna is entirely happy or entirely unhappy. I have never asked her directly, and some part of me has never wanted to know the answer for certain. That thread I am going to leave where it is. If you want to keep hearing what the midwife was never allowed to say out loud, subscribe now, because there is more of this story than I have room to give you tonight. And I promise you, it does not end where you expect. I left the community 9 years after Levi died, when I was 51. Not because of the hand-checking, which I had folded so deep into the ordinary texture of married life that I no longer registered it as strange, but because of a birth that went wrong in a way the community's rules would not let me prevent, and because of a silence afterward that I could not carry 1 more year. That is a different story, one I have told elsewhere on this channel, and I will not retell it fully here. What matters for this story is what I did after. I moved 40 minutes away to a small rented house with a kitchen too small for canning and a quiet I did not know what to do with for the first 6 months. I stopped attending church. My eldest daughter stopped speaking to me for 2 years. Invitations to family gatherings thinned out and then stopped arriving entirely. A box of my mother's dishes, which I had asked to be sent, came back unopened, marked in my sister's handwriting, not at this time. I did not leave as a hero, and I want to say that plainly. I left confused and afraid and unsure for a long while whether I had done something brave or something selfish. And there were nights in that small rented house when I believed both of those things within the same hour. I sat in a counselor's office 18 months after I left. A woman named Diane with a quiet voice and a box of tissues she never once pushed toward me. And I told her, almost as an aside, almost as a joke, about my hands being checked before my wedding. Twice. And then checked again most Sundays for years after that. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I have never forgotten. She said, "What you're describing is a form of coercive control, and it doesn't stop being that just because it was normal." I sat with that sentence for a long time. Coercive control. I had a phrase now for something I had lived inside for 31 years without a name for it, something I had mistaken for most of that time for simply what marriage was. Before that sentence, I remembered my hand in Levi's father's hands as an awkward family custom, embarrassing perhaps, but harmless. The sort of thing every bride in our world quietly endured. After that sentence, I understood it as the first checkpoint in a system of ongoing verification that had run underneath my entire marriage, largely invisible even to me, because it had never once needed to raise its voice. Diane asked me, that same afternoon, whether I had ever refused to hold out my hands when Levi or his parents asked to see them. I thought about the question for a long while before I answered. I could not remember a single instance, not once in 31 years. I had held them out the way you hold out a ticket at a gate, automatically, without deciding to, because some earlier version of me had already decided it on my behalf in my mother's front room when I was 19. That is the part I did not understand until Diane's office, sitting across from her with the box of tissues neither of us had touched. It is not only that the checking happened. It is that I had stopped noticing it as checking at all. I had built, without meaning to, a small, quiet room inside myself, where that particular indignity was simply filed under ordinary life, alongside canning and church and the weather. And it took a stranger's plain sentence to open the door to that room and show me what had been kept there the whole time. If you grew up in a place where your body was discussed in a room before you were allowed to speak for it, I see you. If you have ever held out your hands for someone else's approval and called the holding out a choice, I see you. If you have ever laughed along at your own inspection because laughing was the only response the room would permit, I see you, and you are not the only one who has done that. I do not hate the community that raised me, not entirely, not even now. It gave me a patience with pain that I have used at hundreds of bedsides since, a steadiness in crisis that I would not trade away even if I could. But I will not pretend any longer that the good in it excuses what it asked of women's bodies before those women had ever said a single word of their own. Subscribe and like this video if it reached you, and tell me in the comments what part of this stayed with you. I read every single one of them, even the ones that are hard to write. What I carried out of that community, I carry here, so that what happened in the dark does not stay there.